My name is Matt, and this is my intermediate video milestone number 2 for educational technology. And for this video, I'm going to go over some of the background of my research paper, especially for those who haven't seen any of my previous work, and provide a very quick recap of the last video milestone. And then following that, I'll discuss how I conducted my survey as it relates to my research, how I started off in a pretty manual, tedious method for collecting survey results, and how I eventually switched to a more streamlined approach so you get a significant number of responses. Um, After that, I'll share some of the preliminary survey results. I asked around 23 questions, one of them being fill in a text box, and some of them are pretty interesting, and those are the ones I'm going to be sharing. And then following that, I'll discuss some of the things I learned as a result of conducting my first academic survey. And then finally, I'll share what are the final next steps, given that there's only 2 to 3 weeks left of this course. So for the background, my original research topic was comparing online learning environments pre-COVID and post-COVID, and whether as a result of this pandemic, a new model or template for development has emerged. And I really originally wanted to look at the build costs and development of online platforms, but that sort of shifted over the next few weeks, and I really started focusing on the process and really focusing on the experience of the professors and the students themselves. And although I'll still identify if there's an uptick in sharing learning modules within the universities as part of my original scope, I'm really going to be focusing for my research paper comparing the best practice of online education, what that looked like, and what was recommended prior to COVID-19, and what actually happened during the transition. Second thing I want to do is identify if there were any metrics used to measure the success of transitioning from offline to online learning amidst COVID-19. And then also I'll lightly touch on some of the limitations of online education as it relates to COVID-19. Some of those limitations are pre-existing, some of them are new. And as a quick recap of the last intermediate milestone, in that video, I discussed some of the usage statistics from Georgia Tech's Smart Tech Knowledge Repository. That is a platform where professors and students could upload their content, and I really wanted to see if there was an uptick in sharing between and within the university. So I went over some of those statistics last time, and I'll have to polish that for the final report. I also discussed some of my Zotero workflow, how I'm collecting my research papers, how am I citing them, how am I reading through them and incorporating them into my draft. And then I also discussed some of the survey questions I was going to conduct. And then obviously I shared the next steps, which I'm going over this week. So I'll jump into my survey methodology, how it started off as a manual process and how that kind of changed over time. But before going into that, I originally had my survey filled out in Google Forms, and I sent that out to a handful of people, not only within Georgia Tech, but then a few other professors. And one really nice piece of feedback I received from a person from Georgia Tech was that I should probably migrate that form from Google to Qualtrics, given that Qualtrics has built-in analytics and it just offers a more polished look, and I might get a better response rate. So I actually did that. And just as a quick comparison, on the left-hand side is the Google form, and then I manually moved it over into Qualtrics. So this is completely free. I learned it's an amazing piece of software. Slight learning curve how to create the surveys themselves, how to generate links, but otherwise pretty painless. And I think it's well worth it in retrospect. And then I'll also go over now what I did to start collecting responses from different professors. And again, my target was predominantly professors. So as you can see from this graph, I started sending out the survey maybe 10 days ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, around June 28th. And you could see that there's basically 1 to 2 responses on the 28th, 1 to 2 responses on the 29th, and it was getting pretty bleak around July. And part of the reason why is I was effectively creating handcrafted emails to my group of professors that I knew personally and their acquaintances. Not only that, but not everyone was responding to the survey themselves. So you could see on the 28th and 29th, not many responses there. So I had to switch gears a little bit, and you could see, and I'll go over why on July 2nd, 3rd, and over the July 4th weekend, there's a spike in responses. So I'll talk about how I accomplished that. So instead of just going through my circle of professors, and this is actually one of the pieces of feedback I received last week or 2 weeks ago was how am I going to collect some of the survey results. So what I wanted to do was have a geographically dispersed data set, meaning I wanted professors to respond from all across the nation, from Washington, North Dakota, down to Florida and Texas and the Midwest itself. So you can see on the right-hand side, I plotted out on Google Maps the different schools I contacted. And not only did I contact a variety of different schools, but I did it across disciplines as well, meaning whether it was accounting, art, chemistry, chemical engineering, math, I basically reached out to a variety of different professors across different subjects. And how I did that was I basically went to each of the different academic websites, for example, mit.edu or SYR for Syracuse.edu, and I started going through the department websites. And you can see, for example, this is one website where it actually provided their contact information. I inspected the HTML there, and you notice that there's the mail to tag there. So what I ended up doing was I wrote a variety of different scripts, and the reason I had several scripts was each website really formatted their HTML differently, so I had a handful of them. But I basically extracted their emails. But I didn't just blast email them. What I actually did for each of the different schools and departments was I still handcrafted the email, not individually, but per department and per school. For example, you can see in this one for Georgia Tech in particular, I mentioned that I was in Dr. Joyner's educational technology course. And the reason why I still personalized this was there were several reasons for this. I didn't want the emails to get marked as spammed or flagged for whatever reason. I also limited the number of emails I sent out at one given time because I didn't want to get throttled, given I don't know much about internal Georgia Tech's email system. So I still handcrafted those emails. So as a recap, gathering survey results is not trivial. I pretty much spent around 10 hours in order to collect these responses, which I'm now going to go over. So giving a peek into the survey results, ultimately, out of several thousand emails I sent, I actually got a pretty nice number of responses. So they started trickling in over the July 4th weekend. Start off with maybe 10, 15 on July 1st, maybe 30, 40 more on July 2nd. And then throughout the weekend, since people are pretty much at home right now, I hit around 264 at the time of this presentation, which is a considerable amount, way beyond my expectations. I initially thought I would only get maybe 40 responses or 50, so 264, I'm quite pleased with that. So I'll go over maybe 4 or 5 different of the survey results and how these questions relate to my research paper. So one of the best practices that I encountered as part of my research was ensuring that there was sufficient autonomy and flexibility in budget for each of the different professors as they transition from offline to online education in the midst of COVID-19. And you can see on this question, which is how much budget did you receive from your academic institution to support the transition? Almost everyone said none at all. So this is somewhat diametrically opposed to some of the best practices that are recommended. Next up is, for the current semester, how are your lectures being delivered? Many of us did some of the research around online education early on in the semester about online education being an equalizer because you could refer to third-party content. And I was actually pretty surprised to see that only, I think, 1 or 2 people actually use third-party content. Almost all the professors either, one, pre-recorded their lessons and uploaded it so that they could be viewed at the student's discretion, or 2, they performed live video conferencing, which again, not only is it not a recommendation as you're sort of transitioning to online education, but there's also a learning curve and professors had to transition pretty fast. And I have the numbers on how many days they were given in order before they had to transition online. So I would have really expected professors to refer to third-party content. And as I mentioned earlier in a couple different questions, a couple questions ago, I asked if the professors receive sufficient autonomy or flexibility when making decisions on how to conduct the lectures. And this was a very positive response. Almost everyone stated that they had sufficient, autonomy and flexibility when conducting the lectures. And this actually aligned with the best practice itself, which is great. I'll go over one or two more questions. I was also interested in seeing if any of the professors would incorporate some of the techniques or skills or technology that they adopted during COVID-19, and whether they would apply that technology not only just in the next semester, but maybe in future teaching as well. And you could see from the results that a majority of professors fell into one or two buckets or three buckets. They strongly agree, and somewhat agree. So that means, at least in my opinion, as of now, that COVID-19 was really a forcing function for professors, and there's some silver lining there, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in my research paper. I'm also surprised that not many professors ran into technical glitches. I would have thought that they were gonna experience internet connection issues or software issues, but mostly had zero times in which their live lectures failed. So that was pretty interesting, and it speaks to the software and hardware these days and the maturity of the internet, I suppose, but mainly the software itself as well. And then finally, I wanted to compare whether or not professors were receiving training on online education both before and after COVID. Well, we're still in COVID, but before the outbreak of COVID-19 itself. So almost everyone received between 0 and 1 hours of training. And looking back, I wish I actually modified the survey to explicitly put 0 hours or 1 hours. I'd be curious to see how many professors received zero training. And this one is, again, what professors will do moving forward. Sounds like they're going to be using a hybrid of offline and online education in fall of 2020. And overall, this was a pretty good experience for me. I received some very positive feedback, some constructive feedback, and I'll share just one or two pieces of it. So I had some professors not only respond to my survey, but sent me really lengthy emails discussing some of their experience of COVID-19 and some of the issues they're running into, some of their concerns. Yeah, there's a lot of humanity in this. So this is actually really great seeing the professors care so much about their students and the thinking that they put into and the effort into the lectures. On the more negative side, I wouldn't say necessarily negative, but something for me to improve on in the future if I conduct future surveys is about two professors just started taking the survey but actually declined to finish it because they felt that the survey itself was a little biased, that some of the answers sort of pigeonhole them. And although that wasn't my intention, seems like that was the result still for a handful of them. So if I ever conduct additional surveys, at least within the academic circle or even outside that, I really want to think about how not to create such a biased feel. Obviously, this is a pretty broad topic, but I think it's worth looking into. So earlier, I showed you some of the different quantitative results for the survey, but I also provided a text box answer, just kind of fill in whatever they wanted to do. And it was actually, I have around 4 or 5 pages 6 pages of text box answers here. So I'll definitely try to incorporate some of them. Some of them were very verbose. Many of them were pretty short, like I've been doing online education for a decade. But some of them were really insightful answers. So as a recap on the lessons learned, I definitely, in the future, as I mentioned, don't want to create a bias survey. So I'll have to look into that. And then setting the expectation for myself that not everyone or a very small portion of professors will actually respond to the survey, whether they're busy, whether they didn't receive it, whether the email goes as spam. Just sort of expect that you're going to have a small proportion of people answering the survey. And I'm pretty curious to see what other students in this class experience as well. And then looking back now at my answers and my questions, not all of the questions necessarily relate to my research. So I'm thinking could have probably, well, it's a lot easier now, but I should have analyzed my questions a little deeper to see how they would relate to my original research. So some of them I may just not even incorporate as part of my final research paper, since they're not relevant, but I'm glad that I actually got the data. We'll see how it'll get squeezed in. And the final steps, I'm going to look at the results a little more deeper, and as I mentioned, try to incorporate that as part of my research paper itself. I'll comb through the different text box answers since those aren't presented in nice graph. I'm pretty sure I could use some of the different quotes um, as part of my research paper itself. And then upcoming this week, I'm conducting one qualitative interview with one of the professors that's heavily referenced in my paper. So I reached out to them, and I'll probably be doing that asynchronously, meaning send them email questions and have them respond given there's a time difference, significant time difference. And then finally, I'll shape my final paper into the final product over the next couple weeks, and then obviously work on a final video interview. And that's it. Thanks.